The auction no one was supposed to win. Snowridge was the kind of town where things were handled quietly, where questions about old fires and missing files faded with time. Until one snowy morning, when a retired police canine named Echo was put up for public auction. The bidders were powerful, wealthy, intentional. But in the very last row, a 7-year-old girl named Sienna sat beside her mother, holding a piggy bank so small it rattled like broken hope. She hadn't said a word in 5 years, not since her father, Officer Nathan Blake, died in a fire no one wanted to talk about. Yet somehow, she believed Echo remembered. And somehow, she knew that bringing him home wasn't just about a dog. It was about truth, about memory, about something everyone else had chosen to forget. When the bidding reached a boiling point and silence fell, no one expected what happened next. No one expected Sienna to speak, and no one expected the dog to answer. The sharp creak of folding chairs and the low murmur of voices filled the Snowridge Community Center as the annual winter auction buzzed to life. Light filtered through the tall, frost-laced windows, scattering across rows of chairs and tables adorned with donation baskets and department memorabilia. The smell of brewed coffee mingled with cold air and anticipation. Among the crowd of donors, officers, and townspeople bundled in wool coats, Sienna Blake, just 7 years old, sat almost perfectly still. Her hands clutched a small ceramic piggy bank shaped like a fox. The paint chipped along its ears, but its eyes still wide and bright. She held it to her chest like armor, her small fingers pale against its orange body. Every movement made coins inside rattle softly, like a whisper only she could hear. Her mother, June, sat beside her, one hand resting on Sienna's back, the other fidgeting with a folded bid paddle marked number 18. She scanned the crowd, masking her tension behind a practiced smile. Her eyes flicked to the stage at the front of the room, still empty, but her heart beat louder with each passing second. The auctioneer's voice boomed over the speakers, cutting through the hum of conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Snowridge's annual law enforcement retirement auction," he announced, standing beneath the town seal and flanked by uniformed officers. "Today, we're honoring those who've served, some with badges and some with 4 paws. A polite ripple of applause passed through the room. Sienna's grip on the piggy bank tightened. June leaned closer and whispered, "Remember, sweetheart, just breathe, okay?" Sienna didn't answer. She hadn't, not in 5 years, not since the fire, not since Echo was taken away. But June saw her daughter's throat tense, her small jaw clenched, and her eyes, those solemn, glassy eyes, focused forward with a kind of silence that screamed. The auction continued through the early items. Framed department photos, a signed bat from a charity softball game, dinner coupons donated by local restaurants. June made a show of laughing at the jokes, clapping at the right times. But Sienna never moved. Her eyes never left the stage. Then it happened. The auctioneer adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat with purpose. And now, the final and most distinguished item of the day. Retired K9 Echo. The room shifted. Postures straightened. Conversations stopped. Sienna's heart punched against her ribs. "Echo," the auctioneer continued, "is a 7-year-old German shepherd, formerly partnered with the late Officer Nathan Blake, trained in narcotics detection, search and rescue, and apprehension. Following Officer Blake's line-of-duty death 5 years ago, Echo continued to serve until formal retirement this month. Bidding begins at $2,500. There was a pause, like everyone was holding their collective breath. A man near the front, broad-shouldered, expensive coat, lifted his paddle without hesitation. "Bidder 7,2,500, the auctioneer called out. Sienna's body jolted as if struck. June looked down at her daughter. "Don't panic," she whispered. "We're just getting started." Another paddle shot up. 3,000, then a third. 3,500. The numbers climbed, quick and sharp. June raised her paddle at 4,000. She felt eyes turn in their direction, a few murmurs, but the auctioneer kept rolling. 4,500, 5,000, 5,500. Sienna's breathing grew fast and shallow. Her thumb tapped against the edge of the piggy bank, sending tiny clicks into the air. Across the aisle, two men in dark suits, silent, unmoving, watched the bidding unfold. Behind them, sitting with relaxed confidence, was Carver Hale, CEO of Argonne Security, his navy tie as stiff and sharp as his jawline. He didn't bother raising his paddle. One of his men did it for him. 7,000, the auctioneer called. June flinched. That number was beyond them. She had only planned for 5, maybe 6. She felt her stomach drop. Sienna's fingers tightened. The rattle inside the piggy bank grew louder. 8,000, said another bidder. Carver Hale finally spoke, his voice like oiled steel. 10. Even the auctioneer blinked. 10,000, bidder 22. The room shifted again. June couldn't hide the fear in her eyes anymore. She looked at her daughter, and in that moment she knew Sienna understood everything. This wasn't just a dog. This was her father's shadow, his scent, his memory. This was the only living piece of him that could still look her in the eye and understand what no one else could. Echo had been there in the fire. Echo had returned alone, and then they took him away. But now he was so close. The door behind the stage creaked open. A uniformed officer led Echo into the hall. Gasps filled the air. The German shepherd walked with practiced obedience, but his ears twitched, his nose working furiously. The moment he stepped into the open and saw Sienna, he froze. Then his tail gave a small, single wag. Sienna sat forward in her chair. Echo didn't bark, he didn't whine. But his eyes locked onto hers with such unshakable intensity, it was as if the noise of the auction, the crowd, and the 5 missing years vanished in that gaze. And Sienna's world tilted. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them. She simply held on tighter to the fox-shaped piggy bank. She wasn't going to let them take him again. And somewhere, behind the lights and paddles and money, something old and silent began to stir. The air inside the community center felt colder now, even with the radiators humming beneath the windows. Sienna didn't blink. Echo's presence, his stillness, the quiet way he stared at her as if recognizing a piece of himself, held her in place. And then, like a thread pulled too tightly, memory unraveled. 5 years earlier, the glow of red and blue lights flickered across the windshield of the patrol car as Officer Nathan Blake adjusted his vest. The radio crackled with static, and beside him in the passenger footwell, Echo sat alert, his body tense but ready. "You smell that, partner?" Nathan said with a tired smile. "Burnt plastic and bad decisions." Echo gave a low huff, his nose twitching. He didn't need words. He never did. Nathan reached over, ruffling the fur between Echo's ears. "Let's get it done." The call had come in as a routine drug bust, an abandoned warehouse down by the river, 3rd time this month. Nathan had been on the force for 8 years, long enough to know routine was the most dangerous word in the job. but he hadn't expected this night to be any different than the ones before. He opened the car door. Echo jumped out, hitting the ground in a fluid, practiced motion. They moved like one unit officer and K-9 two halves of something deeper than protocol. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick and chemical. Echo's ears pinned back slightly as they entered. Nathan raised his flashlight. Old pallets, broken crates, scorch marks on the walls. There were no lights, only the weak flicker of a busted exit sign and the hum of something electrical. Then Echo growled, low, controlled. Nathan froze. "What is it?" Echo moved forward 3 steps, then sat, nose aimed at a metal drum. The signal was clear, narcotics detected. Nathan turned toward his shoulder mic. "Unit 4, we've got—" Boom! An explosion ripped through the far wall. The heat was instant. A wall of fire swallowed the eastern end of the warehouse, sending debris into the air. Nathan was thrown off his feet, landing hard against a metal support beam. For a moment the world was spinning, ringing, red. He gasped, coughed, and looked up. Echo was barking, frantically circling him, trying to pull at his vest, at his arm. "Go!" Nathan choked. "Go, boy! Get out!" But Echo didn't move. Even as the fire spread, even as the roof began to groan and splinter, the dog stayed. He pressed against Nathan's side, refusing to leave. Nathan reached up, blood on his hand, grabbed Echo's collar. "You listen to me," he whispered. "You find her." The last thing Echo saw before he was pulled away by a rescue officer was Nathan's hand dropping and the ceiling collapsing above him. Now, back in the auction hall, Sienna's fingers trembled against the ceramic piggy bank. The sound of coins shifting inside echoed faintly through her mind, just like the falling rubble, just like the scream that never made it past her throat that night. She had only been 2 rooms away when it happened, when the police officer came to the door, when her mother fell to the floor, when everything fell silent. She hadn't spoken a word since the funeral, not to her teachers, not to the therapists, not even to her mom, only to Echo. 1 year after the funeral, Sienna sat on the floor of her bedroom, clutching a framed photo of her dad in uniform, Echo sitting obediently at his side. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Then she heard claws clicking on hardwood. Echo padded into the room, his posture gentle, eyes lowered. He nudged her hand with his nose and lay down beside her, his weight warm and real. "Da," she whispered. Her voice cracked like glass, so quiet she didn't know if she'd really said it. But Echo thumped his tail, slow and steady, as if to answer. "I heard you." From that moment on, he became her voice. Present day, Echo hadn't taken his eyes off her. He stood now in the center of the hall, ears high, tail still. Sienna stared back, unmoving. She couldn't speak, not yet. But something in her heart pulsed against the silence, against the fear, the grief, the 5 years of locked words. She didn't know who was winning the bid. She didn't hear the numbers anymore. The world could keep shouting, but Echo had already chosen. He was here. And for the first time since the fire, so was she. The room, already hushed, seemed to grow even quieter, like the air itself was listening. Echo remained by the handler's side near the auction stage, but his eyes never left Sienna. His body stood poised still, but not at rest, as if he knew his fate hung on something more than just numbers and paddles. The auctioneer cleared his throat again, visibly attempting to reclaim the room's focus. "Opening bid for K-9 Echo stands at $2,500, he announced, trying to inject cheerfulness into the gravity in the room. "Do I hear 3,000? A man in the third row raised his paddle without hesitation. 3,000, bidder number 12. 35, came another. Then, without a word, One of the two suited men beside Carver Hale lifted a finger. 4,000 from bidder number 22, the auctioneer declared, nodding slightly toward Carver's section. From her seat, June tensed. That paddle number 22 belonged to Argonne Security, she remembered from the check-in list. Carver Hale didn't bother looking up. He sat reclined slightly, fingers folded across his stomach, gaze cool. His expression wasn't hungry. It was entitled. He didn't want Echo. He intended to own him. June glanced down at her daughter. Sienna was frozen in her seat, eyes still fixed on Echo. Her small hands gripped the fox-shaped piggy bank like it might shatter under the pressure. It gave a soft clink. The sound was barely audible, but to June it cut like glass. 4,500, came another voice. June raised her own paddle heart hammering. Her voice barely found strength. 5, the auctioneer acknowledged with a nod. 5,000 from bidder number 19. Carver's assistant didn't even flinch. He raised the paddle again. 6,000, the auctioneer said. Do I hear 65? Another bid. 7,000. The room's collective breath drew tight. This wasn't a silent competition anymore. It was war masked in formality. June closed her eyes briefly, willing herself to stay calm. They couldn't keep up. She had maxed out her personal limit with the 5,000 bid. Everything beyond that was stitched together with hope and the quiet promise that maybe, just maybe, someone would intervene. But no one was moving, because no one else in the room could possibly understand what Echo meant to the little girl beside her. Sienna tilted the piggy bank slightly. The coins shifted. She began counting them in her lap, 1 quarter, then another, 2 pennies, 3 nickels. Each clink was a cry she couldn't voice. Another paddle went up. 8,000. Carver's expression remained unreadable. One of his men leaned over and whispered something to him. He gave a faint nod. 10,000, the man called out. The auctioneer paused a moment, clearly surprised. 10,000 from bidder number 22. A murmur rippled through the hall. Echo shifted slightly on stage. His ears flicked. Sienna stopped counting. She stared at the number on the screen. 10,000. June reached for her daughter's hand, but Sienna gently pulled away, not in defiance, but in silent resolve. Across the room, Agnes Monroe, a retired school teacher with snow-white hair, watched from the aisle seat. Her eyes narrowed behind gold-framed glasses. This wasn't right. She stood quietly and made her way toward the side door, disappearing without a word. "Do I hear 11,000?" the auctioneer asked, his voice tighter now. Silence. "Going once?" June opened her mouth, but no sound came. She looked at Sienna. The girl stared at Echo. She was breaking, but quietly, like porcelain under pressure. And the most painful part was, she wasn't even crying. Her silence was louder than any outburst could have been. "Going twice?" Suddenly. 15,000. The room gasped. All heads turned toward the back. Steve Bennett stood there, hand still raised. The tall, weathered rancher in a green wool coat, mostly known for keeping to himself, now drew every eye. Carver's brow ticked ever so slightly. The auctioneer cleared his throat again. 15,000, bidder number 28. Do I hear 16? Carver didn't blink. 20. The word was spoken like a challenge, and just like that, it no longer felt like an auction. It felt like a game of brinkmanship. Every number was a threat. Every raise, a knife in the gut. Sienna's breathing grew shallow. Her hands clenched into small fists on her lap. She turned to June and whispered something. It was so quiet June barely heard it. "Do I still have enough?" It wasn't just a question. It was a child's final attempt to hold on to something the world kept stealing from her. June couldn't answer. Because the truth was, they didn't. The money Sienna had saved since the funeral wouldn't even touch the next bid. But before June could speak, the piggy bank shifted in Sienna's lap. The fox's painted face stared upward, and Sienna placed one hand on its back. The crowd continued to murmur. 25,000, came Carver's voice again. No need for his assistant this time. He was invested now. The auctioneer turned to Steve Bennett. Steve raised his hand. 30. Carver's eyes sharpened. 40. June's lips parted. This was madness. This wasn't about value. It was about power. And Sienna, just a little girl with a shattered voice and a fox-shaped piggy bank, was sitting in the crossfire. Echo let out a low, strained sound. A whine, almost imperceptible. But Sienna heard it. Her fingers trembled. And then, without asking, without seeking permission, she stood. She walked forward, holding the piggy bank tight, each step slow and fragile, like walking through broken glass. All heads turned as the smallest person in the room stepped into the aisle. The auctioneer looked stunned. Carver blinked. And Steve Bennett quietly smiled. But Sienna didn't look at any of them. Her eyes were on Echo, and Echo was already moving. The room fell into an eerie silence as Sienna stood there, small, unmoving, clutching the fox-shaped piggy bank against her chest like a lifeline. The air seemed frozen, suspended in time, as if even the old radiators had forgotten how to hum. All eyes were on her. Echo took a step forward from the stage. Just one. His body lowered slightly, as if drawn by instinct alone. The handler tightened the leash, unsure whether to hold or yield. The auctioneer, visibly flustered, adjusted his microphone and looked toward the front of the room. This is an adult event, he said cautiously, his voice carrying more uncertainty than authority. Bidders must be— I request the floor, came a firm voice from the left aisle. Heads turned. Agnes Monroe had risen from her seat, spine straight despite her years, one hand clutching the strap of her leather handbag, the other slightly raised like a woman both gentle and resolute. Her silver hair was braided neatly behind her shoulders, and her voice, though not loud, had the power to still the room. Madam, the auctioneer blinked. This is a formal proceeding? She's not here to disrupt, Agnes said, walking slowly to the front, her boots clicking softly against the hardwood. She's here because the person you're bidding on isn't just a dog. Carver Hale leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. One of his men shifted slightly. Agnes didn't flinch. She reached the center aisle and turned to face the audience. Her hands didn't tremble. Her gaze swept across familiar faces, neighbors, council members, old students now grown with children of their own. You all know me, she said calmly. I've lived in this town since the summer Nixon resigned. I taught half of you how to hold a pencil. And I have never, not once, asked for this microphone. The auctioneer hesitated, then gestured to the sound technician. A light click, and the mic went live. Agnes stepped up and took it with surprising steadiness. Her name is Sienna Blake, she said, turning to gesture toward the little girl in the center aisle. She's 7 years old. She lost her father, Officer Nathan Blake, in the line of duty when she was just 2, and ever since that night she's spoken only to one soul on this earth. She paused. Her voice didn't crack. It didn't need to. That soul, Agnes continued, is standing on this stage, wearing a canine harness and watching her like she's the only thing that matters. A murmur moved through the crowd. Echo's ears twitched. He sat slowly, eyes never leaving Sienna. Agnes turned to the auctioneer. "I'm not asking you to break a rule," she said. "I'm asking you to see the girl in front of you and recognize that this isn't a business transaction. This is a child's last thread to a father who gave his life for this town. If we take this from her, we're not just selling a dog. We're telling her that what she lost was never hers to begin with." The silence was absolute. Then, in a move that stunned even June, Agnes knelt down beside Sienna and whispered something only the girl could hear. Sienna blinked, her jaw trembled, but then she nodded. Agnes rose again and turned toward the stage. "She has something to say," she said, "but I won't make her if you say no." The auctioneer looked to the town clerk. The clerk glanced toward the back where Councilwoman Marion Reed had appeared in the doorway, arms folded, her expression unreadable. After a moment's pause, the clerk gave a slow nod. "She may speak." June covered her mouth with her hand, holding back a sob. Sienna took one step forward, then another. The clinking of coins inside the ceramic piggy bank echoed with each motion, soft and rhythmic like a heartbeat. Her knees trembled slightly under her dress, her boots making quiet thuds on the wooden floor. She walked past strangers, donors, city officials, even past Carver Hale, who for the first time showed the faintest glint of discomfort behind his controlled exterior. She reached the space near the stage. Echo stood up, still restrained but alert. His eyes were glowing with the kind of focused stillness only a dog who knows who he belongs to could ever carry. Sienna stopped. Her breath hitched. Her throat moved. June stood now, her hand pressed to her own chest, not daring to speak. And though no words had yet been said, the room already knew something powerful was coming. Sienna stood beneath the soft glare of the overhead lights, the worn wooden floor stretching out before her like a stage she never asked to stand on. The fox-shaped piggy bank trembled in her small hands, its painted smile at odds with the way her fingers gripped its ceramic body tight, white-knuckled, desperate. Echo sat motionless at the edge of the stage, his chest rising slowly, eyes locked onto hers, as if he too had forgotten the crowd, the rules, the leash, the time lost between them. The auctioneer stepped back from the mic. Not out of courtesy, out of awe. Sienna glanced once toward her mother, then toward Agnes, who nodded gently, both women holding back the tide of emotion now swelling behind their eyes. Her boots shifted against the floor. The piggy bank clinked softly. Then her lips parted, and for the first time in 5 years, a voice broke free from the prison of her silence. "He's not just a dog." Her words came out fragile, thin, like a candle's flame struggling in the wind but still lit. The crowd seemed to lean closer, as if the air itself had hushed to let her speak. "He's all I have left of my dad." The last word caught in her throat, but she pushed through it. There was no grand performance in her voice, no rehearsed plea, only truth, cracked and shaking, but real. The kind of truth that made grown men forget their auction paddles and turn their eyes to the floor. Carver Hale's jaw tightened. For the first time, his composure shifted into something else. Unease. Sienna looked down at the fox in her hands. "I saved every penny," she whispered, barely audible, "since the day they told me he wasn't coming home." Then, with both trembling hands, she raised the piggy bank above her head and let it go. Crack! Ceramic shattered against the floor like breaking glass in a chapel. The sound was sharp, final. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Coins scattered in every direction, pennies, quarters, nickels, even a folded $2 bill bouncing across the polished wood like falling stars. The echoes of the crash lingered in the silence. Sienna didn't move. She stood amid the ruin of her savings, surrounded by everything she had left to give. And Echo? He moved. Suddenly, powerfully, without hesitation. He pulled hard against the leash. The officer holding him staggered. Echo broke from command and leapt off the stage, landing in a crouch that became a sprint. The room gasped again, but not out of fear, out of recognition. He wasn't charging, he wasn't misbehaving, he was returning to her. Sienna dropped to her knees just as Echo reached her. His massive frame slid into her arms like he'd been aiming for them all along. His head pressed into her chest, his front legs curled gently around her sides, and his body curved as if trying to wrap around her entirely, shielding her, holding her, claiming her. Sienna buried her face into his fur, and for the first time in 5 years, she let go of the silence. A sound escaped her throat, not a word, but a cry. A sob so soft and aching, it split June's heart in two. The handler stepped forward instinctively, but the auctioneer raised a hand. Don't. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Even Carver Hale said nothing. Agnes turned away, tears shining in her eyes. And in that charged stillness, a room full of strangers remembered what love looks like when it refuses to die. The only sound left was the quiet click of a coin still spinning in the center aisle. The moment Echo wrapped himself around Sienna, the auction lost all meaning. The numbers, the paddles, the suits, all of it faded like background noise in a story that no longer belonged to bureaucracy. It belonged to them. For one suspended breath of time, no one dared interrupt the reunion. The child curled into the fur of the only soul who had heard her voice in half a decade, and the dog whose silence had spoken volumes in her absence. Then reality cracked through. "Order!" the auctioneer stammered, stepping back up to the mic. We need to... There's protocol to follow. Security, please." The handler hesitated, hand hovering above Echo's collar, but the dog let out a low growl, deep and uncharacteristically firm, not of aggression, but of warning. Sienna's arms clung tighter around his neck. "Don't," June said sharply, standing now between them and the approaching officer. Her voice, controlled but fierce, stopped him mid-step. Councilwoman Marion Reed entered fully from the back of the room, speaking before the auctioneer could spiral further. "Let the child have her moment," she said simply. Her presence cut through the room like a gavel of its own. She walked forward, slow but certain, scanning the crowd with sharp eyes. "But we do need clarification." The auctioneer nodded quickly, grateful. Yes, of course. "But the terms, Echo is still technically a departmental asset. Decommissioned, yes, but not reassigned, without full council approval." "He stays with her," came another voice. Steve Bennett, still standing at the back, hands in the pockets of his wool coat. "Bidder number 28 relinquishes competitive claim in full. I have no further interest in ownership, but I'll be damned if I stand by and let a girl lose the last piece of her father to men with thicker wallets." Gasps. A slow rise of applause began at the edges. Carver Hale, still seated, tilted his head slightly. The smile he wore was thin, not amused. Then his lawyer stood. "Objection," the man said clearly. "My client submitted the final legal bid prior to the interruption. If procedure is ignored here, the department opens itself to litigation. We respectfully request enforcement of auction protocol." "And what exactly," Councilwoman Reed asked coolly, "do you plan to do with Echo, Mr. Hale?" Carver finally stood. He adjusted his cufflinks first, slow, measured. "That's proprietary." June stepped forward. Echo was my husband's partner. He saved Nathan's life 3 times before the fire, and after it, he came back broken, just like Sienna. They only ever made sense together. So if your interest is proprietary, then my question is this: why now? Why bid for a dog 5 years removed from his prime? Carver didn't answer, but in his silence, the answer became obvious. Councilwoman Reed turned to the auctioneer. Pending further discussion and review, I recommend temporary placement of K9 Echo with the Blake family under protective supervision. Final placement to be decided at the upcoming town council hearing. The room erupted. Applause relieved, genuine burst forth from nearly every corner. Even a few officers clapped softly, nodding toward Sienna and Echo, who now lay curled together at the base of the stage. The handler stepped back. The auctioneer nodded rapidly. Yes, effective immediately. Temporary custody granted. Echo will be released into Ms. June Blake's care. Carver's lawyer sat down with clenched teeth. Carver said nothing, but his eyes were already calculating. Across the room, Agnes stepped beside Sienna, her expression unreadable as she crouched and placed a hand lightly on the girl's trembling shoulder. Sienna looked up at her, eyes wide, cheeks streaked with silent tears. Agnes leaned close and whispered just loud enough for her and no one else. "It's only the beginning, sweetheart." And it was. Not just for Sienna, not just for Echo, but for the town of Snowridge, which had just witnessed something too pure for procedure and too powerful to ignore. That night, love had outbid money. But the fight for truth? That was just starting. The door creaked open just past dusk, the winter air trailing in like a quiet guest behind them. June held it ajar, watching as Sienna stepped over the threshold, her mittened hand wrapped tightly around Echo's leash, though the German shepherd hardly needed it. He wasn't pulling. He wasn't scanning the room like a stranger. He was walking like he remembered, like he already knew the way back. The house had changed in small ways. Curtains, paint, furniture worn down with the weight of absence. But some things were untouched. The polished wooden floors, the worn rug beneath the stairs, the scent of lavender still clinging to the old wool throw folded on the couch. Sienna took a step forward, Echo's body brushing gently against her side as if to remind her, "I'm here now." June stood quietly in the doorway, eyes tracing the outline of the dog's frame against the amber glow of the living room light. He looked older, more gray in the muzzle, more tension in the hips, but he carried himself with a kind of quiet dignity, like an officer returning to a battlefield that had once been home. "Welcome back," she whispered. Echo's ears twitched. He looked toward her just once. Then, slowly, he padded into the center of the room and sat down, not because he was told, but because he belonged there. Sienna dropped her coat on the entryway bench and knelt beside him, arms sliding naturally around his neck. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Echo pressed his forehead to her shoulder, eyes closing for a long, still second. It had been 5 years, and yet, somehow, it was as if time had paused at that doorstep, waiting for this moment to happen. Later that evening, after hot cocoa sat half-finished on the table and the fireplace cracked with a slow, steady rhythm, Sienna led Echo up the narrow staircase with deliberate steps. The old hardwood creaked beneath her socks. She pushed open a door at the end of the hall, her father's old study. Dust motes danced in the golden spill of the hallway light. June hadn't entered this room in months, maybe years. Inside, against the far wall, sat a cedar chest. Sienna approached it with quiet reverence. Echo following close behind. She knelt, fingers fumbling with the latch, then slowly lifted the lid. Inside were things no one else had touched since the funeral. A folded uniform shirt still bearing the faint scent of cedar and aftershave. A pair of military-style dog tags, cool to the touch, tied with a knotted green cord. A badge number 314 worn at the edges, polished once with pride. And an envelope marked, "For Sienna, when she's ready," tucked beneath a stack of old photographs. Sienna picked up one of the pictures. Her dad stood tall, arm draped over Echo, both of them grinning beneath the late summer sun. Her younger self peeked in from the side of the frame, cheeks sticky with ice cream, fingers clutching Echo's ear like a security blanket. She held it up to Echo. The dog in the photo and the one beside her looked the same, and didn't. But when Echo saw it, he gave a low, soft sound. Not a growl, not a bark, a whimper. And then something strange happened. Echo stepped around the chest, nose twitching, ears alert. He circled once, twice, then stopped in front of a low bookshelf beneath the window. He pawed at it. Sienna tilted her head, confused. June, watching from the doorway now, stepped in. "Echo?" The dog pressed his nose against the edge of the lowest shelf, then gently scratched at the floorboard beneath it. There was a faint click. Sienna crawled closer. "What is it, boy?" June knelt beside her daughter, brushing her hand along the wooden slats. One piece didn't quite align with the rest. She pried at it carefully until a thin board lifted free. Beneath it, wrapped in a singed cloth, lay a notebook, blackened at the corners. Edges curled from heat. June's breath caught in her throat. Sienna reached for it, but June gently held her hand back. "Let me," she said softly. She unfolded the cloth and opened the first few pages. Inside, in her husband's handwriting scrawled hastily in pen, smudged with ash, were names, dates, symbols, and fragments of something that looked like chemical formulas. One word had been circled 3 times in red ink: meridian. June stared at the page, heart pounding in her ears. She hadn't seen this before. Nathan had never mentioned it, and yet Echo had known exactly where to find it. Behind her, Sienna pressed her head against Echo's side. The dog didn't move. He stared straight ahead, ears low, body still, but his breathing had changed, a soft hitch, a pause between inhales. He remembered. Whatever was inside that notebook, whatever had been hidden beneath that floorboard, was not meant to be forgotten. The fire was everywhere. Orange flames bloomed across black rafters, crawling like angry veins through the skeleton of the warehouse. Smoke twisted around the beams like nooses. The air cracked and snapped as metal bent and screamed. Through it all, June could see Nathan, his figure silhouetted in the inferno. He was trying to speak, but the fire devoured his voice. His uniform was torn, blood on his temple. One arm reached out, fingers trembling, reaching for her. But she couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't save him. The heat surged forward, blinding white. And then, "June." The voice came from the smoke, familiar, desperate. "Don't let them bury it. Don't let them bury me." She gasped awake. The bedroom was dark, moonlight pooling faintly on the floor. Her chest heaved, skin damp, hair clinging to her temples. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She turned to the empty side of the bed where Nathan used to sleep. The pillow hadn't been touched in years. She got up quietly and padded down the hall, passing the soft glow of Sienna's nightlight. shaped like a tiny owl. A sliver of warm lamplight spilled out from under the door of the study. Sienna had fallen asleep on the floor there, curled up beside Echo, like he was a living memory she couldn't bear to let go of. June leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She watched the steady rise and fall of her daughter's breathing, and Echo's. The dog was awake, eyes open, watching the door as if he'd known she was coming. June stepped inside, careful not to wake Sienna, and knelt beside Echo. She reached out hesitantly and rested a hand on his fur. It was strange how comforting he was, and even stranger, how much he knew. Her thoughts returned to the notebook they'd found earlier. The scorched pages, the strange formulas, the red-inked name of a company Nathan had never mentioned, Meridian. She whispered the word aloud now. It tasted like metal. Nathan had been methodical. If he'd hidden something, he had a reason. But why hadn't he told her? Why keep it secret? Unless he'd never had the chance. Unless he'd been silenced. Her breath caught again, and for the first time in months, she let herself cry quietly, because Sienna was sleeping, and she didn't want the child to see her break. But the tears came anyway, unwelcome and warm. She wiped them away, stood slowly, and turned toward the bookcase to retrieve the notebook once more. But before she could take a step, Echo moved. Not suddenly, not violently, with intent. He stood up, padded toward the wall beneath the opposite bookshelf, and began to scratch. One paw, then another, just like before. June crouched beside him. "What is it?" she whispered. Echo scratched again, more insistently this time, then stepped back, nose pointed at the floor like a laser. June brushed her fingers along the seam of the baseboard. One section felt looser than the rest. She pried at it with her nails, then with the corner of a brass picture frame. After a long second, the board popped free. Inside, wrapped in what looked like melted plastic, was another notebook. This one was nearly destroyed, charred around the edges. Entire sections burned straight through. But a few fragments remained. She peeled back the first legible page, her hands trembling, handwritten notes, again in Nathan's script. Words underlined, circled. A name, Hale, with a question mark beside it. And just below, in all caps, Echo alerted twice. Same room, same barrel, marked as Med Experimental. The rest of the page was warped by fire. She stared at it, throat tight. There was no mention of this in the police report. No mention of any investigation into a pharmaceutical lab. No note of any hazardous materials at the scene of Nathan's death. Just a line of duty accident. But that's not what this notebook said, and it's not what Echo remembered. She turned to him again. His eyes were solemn, watching her. Still. "I don't know what you saw," she whispered, "but you didn't forget it." She looked down at Sienna, still asleep with one hand resting on Echo's back. June swallowed hard. Something about that warehouse had been wrong, and someone, maybe more than one, had worked hard to cover it up. Nathan's voice echoed in her mind again. "Don't let them bury me." She wasn't going to. Not now, not ever. The morning light came slowly to Snowridge, soft and pale, as if unsure whether it was welcome. Mist clung low over the rooftops, and the street outside the Blake house remained hushed-like. The town itself knew something had shifted overnight. Inside the kitchen, June sat at the table, her coffee long cold, the charred notebook open in front of her. Dozens of words, half legible, half scarred by flame, sprawled across the pages in her late husband's urgent handwriting. Circles, arrows, fragments of meaning fighting to survive the fire. She had been staring at them for over an hour. Two names repeated most often, Meridian and HX23. She didn't recognize the second one. It sounded like a product code or maybe a chemical designation. Next to it, Nathan had written, "Used in trace amounts, respiratory marker, toxic if heated." And below that, another line, "Echo reacted, twice, same scent, same barrel." June didn't know what any of it meant, but she knew someone who might. Later that day, Agnes Monroe arrived with a scarf wound tightly around her neck and a thermos of black tea in hand. Her brow furrowed the moment she stepped through the door and saw June's face. "You didn't sleep," Agnes said. June only shook her head. They moved to the study where the notebooks lay open on the desk. Agnes lowered herself into the chair beside them and adjusted her glasses. For several minutes, there was only the sound of paper turning and the slow inhale of Agnes reading silently. Then she stopped. Her finger hovered over a single notation. HX23. A long breath escaped her. "I haven't heard that in years," she murmured. June leaned forward. "You know it?" Agnes nodded slowly. "There was an incident at the elementary school. This must have been 10 years ago now. Water testing came back irregular. Nothing major, so they said. But I remember one of the testers mentioning a compound called HX23. He said it was strange, not something they usually saw." June's hands clenched. "They didn't tell the public. They just replaced the old pipes and buried it." Agnes looked up. "Nathan was on the school board back then. I bet he never forgot." June stared down at the page. Neither did Echo. Agnes traced the blackened edge of the notebook. "If this compound is linked to Meridian Pharmaceuticals and whatever happened in that warehouse," her voice trailed off, her expression hardening, "that's not just a cover-up. That's criminal." A quiet sound broke the silence behind them. Sketching. June turned to see Sienna sitting cross-legged on the floor near the window, a worn spiral notebook on her lap. She wasn't looking at them, she was drawing, slow and deliberate strokes with a red crayon. Echo lay beside her, calm but alert. His eyes tracked each movement of her hand. June walked over, knelt beside her daughter, and gently touched her back. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" Sienna didn't answer, but she didn't pull away. She finished the last curved line and held up the page. It was a symbol circular with 3 pointed spokes radiating outward like a sun, but jagged, unnatural. June blinked. It looked familiar. She glanced back at Nathan's notebook. Agnes had already turned to the next page and gasped softly. There, scribbled in pen beneath a note about chemical markers, was the same symbol, crude, hurried, but unmistakable. Echo alerted to this mark on crates, not standard labeling. "Where did you see this, Sienna?" June asked softly. Sienna pointed to the photograph still on the desk, one of the few that had survived the fire. It was a picture of Nathan and Echo standing in front of the warehouse on the night of the incident. Behind them, nearly out of frame, was a rusted metal barrel with a barely visible logo. June leaned closer, squinting. The same shape. She felt her stomach turn. "Echo," she whispered. "You knew." The dog stirred beside Sienna, sitting upright now, tail still. June picked up the notebook and the drawing, her voice quiet but certain. "Whatever this symbol is, it connects everything. The warehouse. Meridian. Nathan." Agnes nodded grimly. "And someone went to a lot of trouble to erase it." June stood slowly, her hands trembling. But it wasn't fear this time. It was purpose. "They tried to bury it," she said. "But they forgot one thing." She looked at Sienna, then down at Echo. "You can't bury what a dog remembers." The oak-paneled office at Town Hall was dim, despite the noon sun outside. Heavy drapes muffled the light, and the air smelled faintly of old cigars and varnish. Mayor Holden stood near the window, nursing a glass of watered-down bourbon, though his grip on the glass was anything but casual. Across from him sat Carver Hale, legs crossed, one arm draped over the side of the worn leather chair like it belonged to him. His suit was dark charcoal, crisp and unwrinkled, a thin blue handkerchief folded with mathematical precision in the breast pocket. Carver didn't look angry. He looked expectant. "Tell me," he said calmly, "when exactly did this town forget how to follow instructions?" Holden sighed, turning from the window. "You mean the dog?" "I mean the liability parading around like a therapy mascot." Carver's voice sharpened, but only slightly. "Echo was decommissioned prematurely. That much we both know. He should have been turned over for disposal, or at the very least transferred out of the state. But now, thanks to some bleeding-heart schoolteacher and a mute child with a piggy bank, he's back in the Blake house." Holden shifted uncomfortably. "You lost the auction, Carver." "No," Carver corrected. "I stepped aside to avoid attention." His eyes narrowed and his voice lowered an octave. "But that dog? He was trained under Project Houndmark, a program Argonne funded quietly under DoD subcontract. Echo was part of a special scent memory protocol. He was imprinted on a neurochemical compound that doesn't legally exist anymore. HX-23. Holden paled. Carver leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "And yet, here we are. Echo is still reacting to that scent 5 years later, still alerting, still remembering." Holden rubbed his temple. "You told me that whole program was scrubbed." "It was," Carver said smoothly. "On paper. But Echo? He's not paper. He's a liability wrapped in fur. And now, thanks to your town's charming affection for underdogs, he's living in a civilian home, sleeping next to a child, sharing space with a woman whose husband was investigating our biggest client before he conveniently went up in smoke." Holden set down his glass a little harder than necessary. "You're implying a lot for someone asking favors." Carver stood slowly. He walked over to the window, pulling the drape aside just enough to glance at the quiet street below. A school bus rumbled past. A mail carrier waved to a shop owner. This town was too small for big secrets, and that made it dangerous. "You and I both know," Carver said. "Nathan Blake didn't die in a freak fire. He was closing in on something that should have stayed buried. He and that dog uncovered a trace batch of HX-23 at the Meridian warehouse, and if Blake hadn't ignored protocol, he'd still be alive." Holden swallowed hard. "So what are you saying? That you want me to approve some kind of seizure order?" "No," Carver said, turning. "That would leave a trail. I want Echo retrieved quietly, reassigned, retired for real. I don't care if it's a misfiled transport form or a glitch in the animal control database. Just make it clean. No noise, no attention." Holden stared at him. "What if they resist?" Carver's voice turned cold. "Then they're protecting stolen government property, and I'll make sure they know it." A long silence fell between them. Then Holden finally nodded, his voice a dry whisper. "I'll make a call." Carver smiled faintly. He didn't thank him. He just turned, buttoned his coat, and walked out, like the outcome had been written before the conversation ever started. But as the door clicked shut behind him, Holden let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Because in that moment, he knew. Whatever Echo remembered was never meant to survive. And now? It was only a matter of time. The knock came at dusk, 3 sharp raps, firm, unfaltering. Not the kind of knock that asked for permission. June stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, rinsing dishes in the sink while Sienna worked quietly at the table, coloring beside Echo. At the sound, Echo's head shot up. His body tensed, not startled but focused, like a switch had been flipped deep inside him. June dried her hands quickly, glancing at the clock. She wasn't expecting anyone. Sienna looked up too, sensing the shift in the air. Echo rose silently to his feet and placed himself between the girl and the front hallway. Another knock. This time, only 2, slower, calculated. June moved to the door and pulled it open just a few inches. Standing on the porch in a navy wool coat, with snow melting slowly on his shoulders and not a single flake on his shoes, was Carver Hale. His smile was small and practiced. "Miss Blake," he said warmly, "may I come in?" June didn't move. "It's not a good time." "It rarely is," he replied, still smiling, "but I'll be brief." She hesitated, then opened the door fully, just enough to let the conversation be heard inside. Carver stepped in, brushing non-existent snow from his coat sleeve as he scanned the entryway. His gaze flicked across family photos on the wall, one of Nathan in uniform, one of Sienna on a tire swing, and landed briefly on the open study door at the end of the hallway. Then Echo appeared. His nails clicked softly on the floorboards. He moved into view like a shadow with muscle, eyes locked onto Carver with unblinking intensity. Carver stopped mid-step. "Well," he said softly, "aren't you as sharp as they say?" Echo didn't growl. Not yet. June crossed her arms. "You came here for something." Carver turned to her, all civility. "I did. I'd rather not waste your time or mine, so I'll be blunt." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a single white envelope, thick, sealed. "I'd like to propose a private settlement, one that honors your husband's memory and allows your daughter to move forward peacefully." June didn't take it. "What is this?" she asked. "Compensation for Echo's return to Argonne custody." "You mean buying him back?" Carver smiled faintly. "We could say reacquisition." He was trained under a federal protocol, technically still considered proprietary property. She let out a sharp breath. "He's not a thing." "No," Carver said, tilting his head. "But he is a problem. You and your daughter may not realize it, but Echo's scent programming was never fully cleared. That dog's brain holds responses to compounds that no longer exist on any legal registry. Reactions like his? In the wrong hands, they raise questions. Questions turn into investigations. Investigations uncover things. Dangerous things." June's eyes darkened. "You're not here for Echo," she said quietly. "You're here for what he remembers." Carver didn't deny it. He stepped forward, extending the envelope again. "I'm offering you a way out, a clean exit. No noise, no legal fights. Enough to move, start fresh somewhere quiet, somewhere safe." June looked at the envelope, then at the man holding it. Then she glanced past him toward her daughter in the other room, toward Echo, who now stood rigid, tail low, eyes fixed. She didn't take the envelope. She took a step closer to Echo. "No," she said simply. Carver's eyes narrowed just slightly. His voice lowered. "You're a mother," he said, "and I respect that. But mothers, especially single ones, don't always know when they're putting their children in harm's way. That was it. That was the line, a veiled threat, wrapped in velvet. Echo took one step forward. His lips lifted, just enough to expose his teeth. A sound emerged, not loud, but low and primal. A growl, one that hadn't been heard since the warehouse fire. Carver froze. Echo didn't move further. But the message was clear. June met Carver's gaze, her voice quiet but razor-sharp. "You can keep your envelope." Carver straightened his coat slowly. "Some memories," he said, stepping backward toward the door, "are better left buried." June opened the door for him, but it was Echo who followed him to the threshold, just far enough to make sure he knew where the line was. Carver turned once at the bottom step, and for the first time since he entered the house, he said nothing. He just walked away. June closed the door behind him, her hands trembling, but not from fear, from resolve, because now she knew something for sure. Echo hadn't just come home to protect Sienna. He had come back to finish what Nathan started. The phone call came just past 7 p.m., while June was tucking Sienna into bed. Agnes's name lit up the screen with an urgency June felt in her bones. She stepped into the hallway, answered with a quiet, "Agnes?" "I need you to meet someone," Agnes said without preamble. "Tonight." June paused. "Who?" "A man named Michael Day. He used to write for the Snowridge Observer before it got bought out. Now he mostly ghostwrites political pieces. But 5 years ago, he was working with Nathan." June gripped the phone tighter. "Working on what?" Agnes's voice lowered. "A story. A dangerous one. They were investigating Meridian Pharmaceuticals, and I think whatever they found, it didn't just vanish with the fire. I think it's still out there. And Michael believes Echo knows where." They met in the back booth of Gibson's Diner, the kind of place with flickering neon signs and coffee that tasted like burnt toast but felt like home. The blinds were half drawn, the lights dimmed low. Agnes sat beside June, her hands folded neatly. Across from them, Michael Day leaned back in his seat, gray stubble lining his jaw, wire-frame glasses perched low on his nose. He looked like a man who'd seen too much and couldn't forget any of it. "I was never supposed to talk about this," he said, glancing once toward the kitchen, then back. "But I think it's time." He slid a yellowed envelope across the table. Inside were 3 printed emails stapled together, each bearing Nathan Blake's name and a Meridian Company header. He'd been feeding me internal memos documents about a chemical trial they were running off the books. Not FDA approved, no oversight. They were using HX-23 as a neurological tracer something to stimulate hyper-response in military canine units. June's breath caught. "That's what Echo was trained on," she whispered. Michael nodded. "Exactly. But they discontinued the compound after a batch caused seizures in test subjects, both dogs and handlers. It was meant to be destroyed, but Nathan found traces of it still in circulation. He was chasing it through a warehouse linked to Meridian's logistics branch when the fire happened." He paused, his eyes darkening. "I was supposed to meet him the day after. He never showed." June leaned forward. "And Echo?" Michael's voice dropped to a whisper. "Nathan told me Echo had been trained to alert specifically to HX-23. Not just any scent, that one. It's buried deep. And it sticks. Dogs like Echo don't forget it, even years later." Agnes looked at June. "That's why he scratched at the floor. Why he found the second notebook." Michael nodded. "Nathan used Echo like a walking hard drive. Every alert, every scent imprint, it's in him. Your husband was meticulous. He left no trail on paper. But Echo? Echo was the trail. June felt her chest tighten, a cold knot forming in her stomach. Carver Hale came to my door yesterday, she said quietly. He offered money to take Echo back. When I refused, he said something, "Some memories are better left buried." Michael's expression didn't change. That sounds exactly like Carver. You knew him? Once. He ran PR for Meridian's defense contract division before founding Argonne. Polished, dangerous, the kind of man who smiles while the house burns. Michael leaned closer, lowering his voice. You need to understand something. Nathan wasn't just sniffing around. He was getting close to something that scared them. He told me he found a shipment mislabeled as medical waste barrels that tested positive for HX-23. He was going to report it to the state board. Then, the fire, June said. Michael nodded. And everything went up with it. Official reports cited electrical failure, convenient. But now Echo's back and he's reacting to things again. That dog is a walking indictment. If Argonne finds him first, they won't try to negotiate again. Agnes placed her hand over June's. We have to protect him. Michael's eyes flicked between them. I can help. I still have contacts, people who care about truth, but this has to be done right. No press releases, no confrontations. We collect evidence. We document Echo's reactions. We rebuild the chain. June exhaled slowly, her voice steady. We finish what Nathan started. Michael gave a small nod. Then we do it quietly. He reached into his coat and slid over a battered recorder. If Echo reacts again, record it. Sound, video, whatever you can. If there's still any trace of that chemical around, he'll find it. And if he does, we'll have more than suspicion. June stared at the recorder, the weight of it disproportionate to its size. Agnes leaned close and whispered, You ready for this? June looked up at them both. No, she said honestly, but I have to be. Because Echo remembered. And that memory might be the only weapon left. The flyer appeared on the bulletin board outside the post office first, then in the window of Gibson's diner, then the library, then church. By noon, it had spread to Facebook groups, email chains, and whispers across town lines. Petition to reassign former K-9 unit Echo to official law enforcement control for public safety. Below the heading was a list of bullet points that painted Echo as unstable, improperly handled, and unsuitable for residence in a home with children. It called for a council hearing to reverse the temporary custody granted to the Blake family. June stood in front of one of the flyers now, her mouth dry as her eyes scanned the text again and again. She'd seen political attacks before, manipulated facts. But this was personal, and worse, dangerously effective. A second petition, hastily drawn and emotional in tone, had surfaced in response, this one calling for Echo to remain in Sienna's care permanently. Now the town was divided. By midweek, the council hall was full standing room only. Teachers, business owners, retirees, sheriff's deputies, parents holding toddlers on their hips. Some wore yellow ribbons in solidarity with Sienna. Others wore silver pins that read, Protect the Public. June stood near the back, flanked by Agnes and Rick, her brother who had quietly returned to town just 2 days earlier. Sienna stayed home under Agnes's watchful eye. Up front, Councilwoman Reed tapped the mic. We are not holding a formal vote today, she began. This is an open forum to hear community concerns regarding the temporary placement of Echo, the former canine service dog with the Blake family. This is not a legal proceeding. That hearing will come later. A woman stood first. Young, polished, the kind of smile that rarely reached the eyes. "My son attends Ridgeview Elementary," she said. "And while I have sympathy for the Blake girl, I do not want to risk an incident. That dog is trained to attack. What happens when it mistakes a child for a suspect?" Murmurs, a few nods, then a retired firefighter stood. "I've seen that dog pull children from rubble. I watched him sniff out a lost boy in the woods in under 20 minutes. That ain't aggression, that's instinct." A man in a blazer rose next. "There's a report going around an incident at the park. Said Echo growled at a toddler. Cornered him." June's head snapped toward the speaker. "That's not true," she said sharply, stepping forward. "That boy had a bag of jerky in his jacket. Echo sniffed it and sat beside him. I was there." The man shrugged. "That's not what people are saying." "And who exactly is saying it?" she shot back. "Or are we just building cases on rumors now?" Behind her, Agnes gently placed a hand on her arm. "June," she murmured. But June wasn't finished. She walked to the front, her voice strong now, controlled but firm. "My husband died in the line of duty. Echo came back from that fire a different dog, yes, but not dangerous, not broken. He came back, remembering." She scanned the room, meeting the eyes of people she'd grown up with, taught alongside, stood beside at funerals and fundraisers. "My daughter didn't speak for 5 years," she said. "Not a word. Until Echo came back." "And now you want to rip him away based on anonymous rumors and a piece of paper on a bulletin board?" Silence. Not guilty silence, uncomfortable silence. And then from the far corner of the room, a voice said, "The flyers came from Argonne." Everyone turned. Michael Day stepped forward, holding a stack of printed emails in one hand. He raised them like a flag. "These were sent from an internal Argonne PR address to a town contractor who helps manage local communications. The same person who printed the park incident story and posted the first petition. Carver Hale's people are manufacturing fear to remove a dog who knows too much." Gasps rippled through the hall. Councilwoman Reed looked visibly alarmed. "Do you have proof of that, Mr. Day?" Michael nodded. "It's in your inbox." People began murmuring again, but this time it wasn't about Echo. It was about intent, about manipulation. June turned slightly to see Rick beside her. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "I've got your back," he said softly. And for the first time since the auction, June felt the tide beginning to turn. But only slightly. Because for every person who clapped quietly after her words, there was still someone in that room who whispered behind cupped hands. Still someone who looked at Echo and didn't see a protector, only a weapon. The meeting adjourned in tension, not resolution. As June walked out beneath the cold evening sky, she looked up at the banners fluttering from the lamp-posts downtown, Winter Festival, Community Spirit, together in Snowridge. She shook her head. Together, she thought bitterly. If only they meant it. The knock on the front door came just after dusk, when the sky outside the Blake home was the color of bruised lavender, and the wind carried the bite of early frost. June opened it to find a man she hadn't seen in 3 Christmases. Rick Blake stood on the porch with snow on his shoulders and regret in his eyes. He wore the same brown leather jacket from his old patrol days, scuffed, faded at the seams, but still intact. Like him. "Hey, Junebug," he said quietly, using the nickname no one else dared. She didn't respond right away, just stared, and then, without a word, she stepped aside. He walked in. The smell of pine cleaner and old wood floors, the faint hum of a radio playing classical music low in the kitchen, and there, curled in front of the fireplace, Echo, head lifting at the sound of new boots on old floorboards. Rick froze. Echo stared. A beat. Then the dog stood slowly, nostrils flaring. "Still remembers me," Rick said, voice catching in the middle. "He remembers everything," June replied, her voice low. "It's remembering that breaks him." They sat at the table without ceremony. No hugs, no dramatic apologies. Just two people who'd both been shattered by the same loss and never quite forgiven each other for surviving it differently. "I should have been there," Rick said finally. "You were on desk duty. It wasn't your fault." "I switched shifts." The fire call went to Nate. June's hands tightened around her mug. "You never told me that." Rick stared at the steam rising from his coffee. "I couldn't. I was afraid you'd hate me." June blinked slowly. "I already did. For a long time." Silence. Honest, uncomfortable silence. Echo padded over and sat beside June, placing his chin gently on her thigh. Her hand found his fur without thought, and then, from the hallway, a soft voice. "Uncle Rick?" Both of them turned. Sienna stood there in her socks, pajama pants bunched around her ankles, hair falling over one eye. She hadn't said his name since she was 2. Rick swallowed hard. "Hey, kiddo." She looked at him, then at Echo. "Are you staying?" "If it's okay with your mom." Sienna walked forward slowly. Echo's tail swept once, gently thumping the rug. Then, unexpectedly, she reached for Rick's hand, held it, and said, "He likes you." It was only 3 words, but to Rick, they sounded like forgiveness. Later that night, after Sienna had fallen asleep on the couch with Echo curled at her feet, Rick pulled a battered notebook from his duffel. "Back when I trained Echo with Nate," he said, "we used imprinting drills, special command structures layered with scent triggers. If Echo is still responding to the fire site, the notebook, the badge, he's not just remembering. He's following a trail." "A trail to what?" June asked. "To whatever got Nate killed." He flipped to a page with sketches symbols, code words, chemical names. Echo stirred, eyes sharp, body alert. Rick set the notebook on the floor. Echo moved instantly, sat beside it, nudged it with his nose, and then he lay down, eyes never leaving the page. "He's waiting," Rick murmured, "for a signal." June looked at her daughter sleeping, one hand wrapped in Echo's fur. "She's been talking more," she whispered. "Not full conversations, but sentences. Always when Echo's near, like he anchors her voice." Rick nodded slowly. "Then maybe she's part of this too." He leaned back in the chair, eyes on the fire. "Echo's not just a retired dog. He's a map. And I think he still knows the way." The storm came without warning. Not outside, but inside the Blake living room, where the fire crackled low and Sienna sat curled up next to Echo, her small fingers absently combing through the thick fur on his neck. It had become a ritual, one that brought her comfort. Her voice, though still rare, was beginning to return in short phrases, mostly whispers, often only around him. That evening she paused. Echo flinched slightly beneath her hand, his ears twitching. Something cold brushed against her fingertips' metal where there should have been fur. Curious, She parted the thick scruff under his collar and felt it again. A small bulge. She sat up straighter. "Mama," she called, louder than usual. "Come here." June, carrying a folded blanket from the hallway, stepped into the room. "What is it, sweetheart?" Sienna turned Echo's collar inside out, and both of them saw it then, a concealed zipper sewn into the leather lining, worn with time, nearly invisible. Rick, who had just stepped out of the kitchen, crossed the room in 3 strides. "Hold up," he murmured. Military-grade collars sometimes had emergency storage for data tags. With delicate fingers, he unzipped the hidden seam and pulled out a thin, dusty USB stick no larger than a paperclip. It was unmarked and old. Everyone fell silent. June glanced at her brother. "We need to see what's on it." Rick nodded, already connecting his laptop on the dining table. The screen flickered. A folder auto-opened. Dusk OP713 Final. He double-clicked. The video stuttered to life. Static first, then a timestamp. 5:47 a.m. March 2nd, 5 years ago. The image cleared. A dimly lit lab, shelves lined with vials and containers marked with faded hazard symbols. The camera was angled from a chest harness shaky, but steady enough to see a figure in tactical gear. Nathan, alive, his face drawn, eyes alert, breathing fast. "Recording log," he whispered, glancing into the lens. "Operative Nathan Blake, Snowridge PD, inside Facility 9, unlisted on municipal records." He turned the corner. Echo was in frame, younger, leaner, ears perked. Nathan held up a gloved hand. "Echo, search." The dog moved ahead. They passed several crates. Nathan scanned the labels. "Compound 7B banned since '04. Why is this here?" He pulled a vial. "Neurotoxin signature matches the water case Monroe flagged back in '98. Suddenly Echo froze, tail stiff, ears locked forward. "Alert," Nathan breathed. "He smells it." He scanned the shelf vials marked with a black triangle and serial codes matching the scribbled notes June had uncovered earlier. "Argonne Security has its fingerprints all over this." The feed jittered. Echo growled low, deep. Then Nathan turned, the light flickering overhead. Something caught his eye. "Wait. Who?" A distant metal clang echoed through the hall. Nathan's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're here." He reached for his radio, then looked straight into the camera. "If anyone finds this, Echo remembers. He knows what they tried to hide. Keep him safe." Then static and blackness. No explosion. No fire. Just the end. Rick leaned back, eyes wide. June pressed a hand to her chest. Sienna stared at the screen, unmoving. Echo, lying beside her, let out a low whine, the kind that lives somewhere between memory and mourning. "He wasn't just documenting," June whispered. "He knew he wouldn't make it out." Rick's jaw clenched. "This changes everything." They sat in silence a moment longer, the weight of the truth settling over them like a second winter. Then Sienna, her voice steady this time, said, "He gave it to Echo because he trusted him more than anyone." And nobody could argue with that. Because even now Echo remembered, and memory was more dangerous than any weapon. The meeting room at Snowridge's old courthouse was too small for the size of the conversation. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the semicircle of polished oak desks, each occupied by a member of the town council. The flag of Snowridge stood upright behind them, limp in the still air. Councilwoman Evelyn Reed sat near the center, her hands folded neatly on a stack of reports she hadn't had the nerve to read yet. To her right stood Sheriff Nolan, rigid in uniform, arms crossed, his eyes narrowed. And at the far end of the room, quiet but present, sat June Blake, her daughter curled up beside her, Echo lying at their feet like a shadow that refused to leave. "Let's not waste time," Nolan said gruffly, stepping forward. "That dog Echo is the property of the Snowridge Sheriff's Department." He was trained under government funds, outfitted using departmental budgets, and registered with a K-9 badge still active on file. Councilwoman Reed met his glare calmly. "We are all aware of the logistics, Sheriff, but property isn't the only concern here." "It should be," Nolan snapped. "This situation has spiraled out of control. That girl," he gestured toward Sienna, who flinched slightly, "walked out of here with a live unit trained to detect controlled substances and potentially dangerous compounds." June's voice was steady but cold. "She walked out with her father's partner." A few heads in the gallery nodded silently. Agnes Monroe, standing in the back row, watched without blinking. Reed shifted in her seat. "Sheriff, you're not wrong about procedure, but let's not pretend this is just about a dog. The people of this town are watching. That viral video, a little girl standing beside the ashes of her father's truth, it's made national rounds in under 48 hours. And sympathy doesn't make law," Nolan fired back. "You want to win a popularity contest, be my guest, but I'm not letting a therapy case dictate how this department handles classified assets." Evelyn leaned forward, lowering her voice as if the act alone could calm the room. "Do you honestly believe reabsorbing Echo into the force right now is the right move? After everything that's come to light?" Nolan hesitated for a fraction of a second. "He's a tool, a piece of evidence, maybe even a liability, but he's ours." Evelyn's voice softened. "And what if he's more than that? What if he's a witness?" Silence. Sienna stirred. Echo lifted his head slightly, eyes flickering between the voices. The room, heavy with political weight and unspoken grief, seemed to tilt toward the little girl in yellow. "Look," Evelyn continued, now addressing the council, "we're in uncharted territory. The footage is damning. The chemical markers Nathan referenced have been verified by Monroe. And yes, Echo was there for all of it." Sheriff Nolan shook his head, jaw tight. "So what's the plan? Let him live out his days in a backyard swing set while federal agencies circle like vultures?" "No," Reed said firmly. "We establish a public vote. We let the community decide whether Echo belongs with the Blakes or back in department custody. Until then, temporary placement stays." "You're opening a door we won't be able to close," he muttered. Reed glanced down at her papers, then up at Sienna. She already opened it the moment she spoke. The gavel tapped once. Decision postponed. Emotions deferred. But the line had been drawn. As the meeting adjourned, June rose and gently squeezed Sienna's hand. Echo rose with them, head held high, eyes locked on the man in uniform. Not aggressive, not fearful, just watching, remembering. The poster on the community bulletin board read only 4 words: "Echo's fate, this Saturday." No images, no explanation, just a date, a time, and a silence that settled like fog across Snowridge. Inside the Blake home, tension crackled beneath the quiet like static before a storm. June stood at the kitchen table, surrounded by flyers, lists of names, and a map marked with red X's homes that had pledged their votes. Agnes Monroe pored over a phone tree, her readers perched at the tip of her nose, voice clipped and sharp. Rick stood at the window, watching for unmarked cars. "They've started sending men to talk to business owners," he muttered. "No logos, no badges, just men asking questions." "Carver," June said under her breath. Agnes didn't look up. That man's trying to lean on fear like it's leverage. It always worked before, Rick said, folding his arms. But this isn't about zoning permits or vendor contracts. This time he's trying to take a little girl's dog. And somewhere in the living room, Echo lay curled by the fireplace, his ears twitching faintly at the tone of Rick's voice. Sienna sat beside him, silent but not detached. In front of her, on the hardwood floor, was a stack of crayons. She wasn't coloring houses or flowers. She was drawing flames. And in the center of those flames stood a man in blue and a dog wrapped in smoke, paw on his partner's chest. The dog's eyes were the only part unshaded left stark and white, staring straight at whoever dared look back. That night, June found the drawing on the dining table unsigned but undeniable. There was a single word at the bottom in blocky 7-year-old handwriting, "Remember." The image hit the internet the next morning, uploaded quietly by Agnes under a caption that read, "Drawn by a child who hasn't spoken to anyone but this dog in 5 years. Her father died in the fire Echo tried to save him from. Now the town is voting whether she can keep him. You decide what kind of world we live in." Within hours, it had been shared nearly 20,000 times. News anchors picked it up before council members even got out of bed. Messages flooded the town's official site. Pleas, prayers, accusations, offers of pro bono legal counsel, donations to cover court costs. And from more than one small-town police department, solidarity. Carver Hale watched it all from his office window with the cold detachment of a man used to owning the board. But that afternoon, when 2 of his usual confidants refused to attend a press briefing, he realized the ground beneath him had begun to tilt. Saturday arrived like a held breath. Snowridge's community center was so packed that people spilled onto the steps. Families held signs, some hand-painted with "Let her keep Echo," others stamped with "Safety first." Emotions didn't fit neatly into party lines. It was about grief and loyalty and whether memory could be owned. Inside, a wooden box was set beside the registration table. The vote would be cast in silence, no shouting, no campaigning, no speeches, just names, check marks, and an act of collective reckoning. June arrived early with Agnes and Rick at her side. Sienna wore Nathan's old academy sweatshirt, sleeves rolled 3 times, the faded initials on the front almost unreadable. Echo walked beside her off-leash, his gait calm but alert, eyes scanning like he remembered what it was like to protect something precious. Carver entered 15 minutes later, flanked by 2 men in suits. He didn't meet anyone's eyes, but his voice carried when he passed Agnes. "You've stirred up quite the circus." Agnes smiled thinly. "Careful, Mr. Hale. Children tend to remember the clowns." The vote began. One by one, townspeople filed past the ballot box. Some nodded to June. Others avoided her gaze, unsure if they were protecting a child or a precedent. Echo sat perfectly still by the stage, only moving once to nudge Sienna's foot gently when she curled her hands into fists. When it was their turn, June let Sienna drop her vote into the box herself. A hush followed the sound of that card landing. Hours later, as counting began behind closed doors, a reporter outside the center called the moment the most divided unity I've ever seen. Rick lit a cigarette he hadn't touched in years. Agnes turned off her phone. Sienna leaned against Echo, her hand on his back, fingers tracing the ridges of his spine like a braille map to something she'd once lost. "I don't know what they'll decide," June whispered, kneeling beside her daughter. Sienna didn't speak. She didn't have to. She just slid her drawing into her mother's hands, creased now, slightly smudged at the corners. But the eyes still stared, white, unblinking, remembering. The first sound was glass. It wasn't loud, not like a shatter, just a brittle, uneasy, crack-like ice giving beneath a hesitant step. June sat up in bed instantly, her ears attuned to the quiet that followed. Then came Echo's growl, low, primal, not the kind he used when chasing squirrels. This one came from someplace deeper, older, a warning carved in instinct. She threw on her robe, heart hammering, and reached for the flashlight in the drawer. The hallway lights were off, but she could hear it movement. Footsteps just outside the front door, then a hiss of spray paint, a metallic rattle. By the time she reached the living room, Echo was already at the front window, his body rigid, tail stiff, eyes locked on the shadows outside. A second later, the porch light flickered to life, and they saw it. 3 words scrawled across the white siding in dripping black letters, "He's not yours." Echo lunged at the door, teeth bared, barking with a fury that didn't come from training, but from memory, from loyalty, from love. June barely had time to react before the porch creaked and the shadows scattered. She opened the door just enough for Echo to push through, launching into the yard like a fired arrow. A figure darted across the lawn, a man, average build, hoodie pulled low, and Echo was on him in seconds. Not biting, not mauling, just chasing, herding, driving the stranger toward the edge of the street where a truck waited, engine running. The man dove in and the truck screeched away, tires carving black lines into the asphalt. Echo didn't pursue. He stopped at the edge of the curb, turned around, and jogged back toward the house. He never looked winded. He looked betrayed. June spent the next hour with her hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee, the porch light flickering overhead like a stuttering heartbeat. The sheriff had come and gone. So had Rick after circling the block 3 times. There were no fingerprints, no security cameras on that side of the house, no leads, just a message sprayed in hostility and fear. Sienna hadn't spoken since the noise. She stood by the window, arms wrapped around Echo's neck, her cheek resting gently on his fur. He hadn't left her side since. June stared at the vandalism, heart aching, not from the words themselves, but from the truth they tried to erase. This was their home. This was her daughter. And that dog. That dog was more family now than most people ever understood. "We could go," Rick said quietly. He was leaning in the doorway, hands in his coat pocket. "Just for a while. Somewhere upstate. Somewhere quiet." June shook her head, rubbing her eyes. "That's what they want. They want to scare us into giving up." Rick didn't argue. He just exhaled slowly, like someone who'd spent a lifetime learning when silence said more. Still, the doubt sat with her all night. Long after Sienna fell asleep with Echo curled around her like a guardian from another world. Long after the police report was filed and the porch was rinsed down. Long after the moon passed overhead and the shadows beneath the tree in their front yard refused to disappear. It was nearly dawn when she stood by the bedroom window, arms folded tight, watching frost paint its way across the glass. Her mind reeled with questions. What if they came back? What if next time they weren't just trying to scare them? What if Echo got hurt? Or Sienna? She didn't hear her daughter pad barefoot across the room. Didn't notice until she felt a small hand slip into hers. Sienna stood beside her in silence, staring out the window too. She was still in Nathan's sweatshirt. The hem brushed her knees now. "He came home for me," Sienna whispered, the words so soft they barely made it to June's ears. "I won't run. June looked down, eyes stinging. "Sweetheart." But the little girl shook her head, just once. Then she turned, walked back to Echo, and laid down beside him again. That morning, June painted over the words herself, not because she was trying to hide them, but because she knew they no longer held power. Not in this house, not with that little girl, and not with the dog who never stopped remembering. The Snowridge Town Hall had never been this full. The old building groaned beneath the weight of bodies packed shoulder to shoulder. Neighbors, teachers, veterans, high school students in school colors. Cameras lined the back wall. Microphones dangled from long booms. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of paper, felt amplified by the tension hanging in the air. At the front, the town council sat behind a long oak table polished to a muted shine. Sheriff Nolan leaned back with arms folded, expression unreadable. Councilwoman Reed adjusted her glasses, lips thin. A flag hung behind them, unmoving. In the front row sat Sienna, small and composed in her father's old police jacket. Her feet didn't touch the ground. Echo lay beside her, head on her shoe, eyes open. He didn't blink. June stood beside the evidence table, a manila folder in her trembling hands. She'd rehearsed this 100 times, in the mirror, with Agnes, with Rick. But now, as she looked at the crowd, at the lawyers with silver cufflinks, at the town that once brought them meals after Nathan's funeral, her throat tightened. A gavel knocked twice. "We now open the hearing regarding the disputed placement and legal designation of the retired K-9 unit, Echo," Reed announced. "All parties will have the opportunity to present evidence and statements." Carver Hale wasn't in the room, but his lawyers were, 2 of them, both in gray, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else than arguing over the fate of a dog. June stepped forward. She placed the folder on the table, opened it with fingers that betrayed her with small shakes. Inside were copies of Nathan's handwritten notes, smeared, partially burned, but still legible. Alongside it, a printed transcript from the video file, a still frame. Nathan, standing in the lab, mouth open mid-warning, Echo in frame, alerting. She cleared her throat. "My husband, Officer Nathan Blake, was investigating a series of chemical inconsistencies before his death. These notes," she tapped the folder, "match a compound later flagged by environmental regulators. The same compound Echo was trained to detect during his service with Nathan." She picked up the flash drive. "This video was found hidden in Echo's collar. It confirms everything, the research, the warnings, the fear." Echo responded to chemical samples inside the lab, then again at home. "This dog," her voice cracked just slightly, "isn't just a companion. He is a living piece of evidence. He remembers what Nathan died for." Echo didn't move, but his tail thumped once against the floor. A murmur passed through the audience. The lawyers stood. "Mrs. Blake," the taller one began, voice cool and practiced, "you're asking this council to trust the instincts of a dog over legal property ownership. Echo was trained under municipal funds. He is technically department property and thus cannot be privately claimed." The other lawyer stood. "Additionally, we have concerns about the environment Echo now resides in. There are credible reports, vandalism, potential danger, even incidents involving the child's unhealthy attachment." A gasp rose from the audience. Sienna looked up at her mother, but June didn't flinch. "You're calling my daughter's love unhealthy?" Her voice hardened. "After watching her father go up in smoke? After 5 years of silence, the only voice that ever came back was because of him." She pointed to Echo. Because he stayed. Because he remembered. Councilwoman Reed held up a hand. "Order, please." The lawyer raised a brow. "We're simply saying the dog may be better utilized under professional care." Rick stood up from the audience, arms crossed. "Better utilized? He's not a machine. He's a sentient creature who's saved more lives than any of you have briefcases." Laughter rippled across the back of the room. "Order," Reed said again, but a smile flickered at the corner of her mouth. The sheriff finally spoke. "I've worked with Echo. I know his instincts. He's flagged more narcotics and compounds than any dog in this state. But the question is whether this placement is safe for him and for the child." Reed turned to June. "Is there anything else you'd like to submit?" June nodded. "Sienna?" The little girl rose slowly. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She walked to the front and placed a folded sheet of paper on the table. It was a drawing crayon on notebook paper. Echo. Fire. Her father. And a small girl holding the dog's leash. A caption. He found what the fire tried to erase. Silence. Real silence. Then finally, Councilwoman Reed leaned in. "We'll take this under review. The council will delay its ruling pending further investigation. But let me be clear, this isn't just about ownership. This is about duty, safety, and truth." The gavel hit the wood once more, but no one moved. Echo did. He stood and walked forward, tail low, steps slow, and rested his head on the evidence table, right beside Nathan's notes, a gesture so human it hurt. The municipal hall smelled faintly of antiseptic and old varnish. A long folding table had been brought in, its metal legs screeching slightly against the wooden floor as it was positioned under the bright overhead lights. Sheriff Nolan stood to the side, arms crossed, jaw tense. Behind him, a chemist from the state lab. A quiet woman named Dr. Ellen Y. methodically arranged a row of sealed containers across the surface. 12 vials, identical in shape and color. Only one held the banned neurotoxin that had been in Nathan Blake's notes. The others? Harmless decoys, cleaning solutions, soil samples, saline, sugar water. And now it was up to Echo. "Are we seriously doing this?" one of Carver's lawyers asked, gesturing dismissively. "This isn't a court of science, it's a public circus, a stunt." "No," Councilwoman Reed replied without looking up from her notepad. "It's a test of memory, of purpose, and whether this town believes in what it helped create." June stood with Sienna at the back, fingers laced tightly with her daughter's. Rick was nearby, eyes locked on Echo. Agnes Monroe observed from a corner, arms folded, quiet as a statue carved from conviction. Dr. Way stepped forward. "For integrity," she said clearly, "neither I nor Echo's handlers will know which container holds the target substance. The vials have been randomized by lab protocol." She nodded once. Sheriff Nolan unclipped Echo's leash. The dog didn't move immediately. He stood still, ears perked, reading the room. Then he stepped forward. One by one, Echo moved down the line. His paws made soft clicks on the floor. He sniffed the first container. Nothing. Second. Nothing. The third, he paused. A slight lift of the head, a shift in posture, but no alert. He moved on. Fourth. Fifth. At the 6th vial, something changed. Echo stopped. His body stiffened, nose close to the glass. He took a single step back, then let out a low, sharp bark. Then he sat. Everyone froze. The hall went still enough to hear the hum of the overhead lights. Dr. Way walked over with gloved hands and lifted the vial Echo had alerted on. She inspected the serial number. checked it against a sealed envelope in her pocket. She looked up. "The substance is confirmed," she said quietly. 2-4-diethylhexyl-8 quinoline carboxylate, banned in 2016 due to neurotoxicity and illegal export under false labeling. Gasps rippled through the room. One of the journalists in the back scrambled to type. A young woman near the door whispered, "That was in the petition." "That's the one Nathan was tracking." June felt her knees tremble slightly, but Sienna squeezed her hand. Echo remained seated, eyes still locked on the vial. "He remembered," Rick said under his breath. "After all this time." Sheriff Nolan broke the silence. For those unfamiliar with detection dog protocol, that behavior stopping, backing off, and sitting is a trained alert. Echo's response is textbook and consistent with his old training logs. The lawyer from Carver's team stepped forward, flustered. "This doesn't prove he's safe with a child, only that he's a well-trained animal. Let's not confuse sentiment with legality." Sienna stepped out from behind her mother. She walked quietly to Echo, knelt beside him, and placed her hand gently on his back. "He didn't forget," she said softly, "just like I didn't." No one stopped her. No one dared. Dr. Way sealed the vial and turned to the council. The dog's alert was accurate and decisive. "I recommend full certification review if you're considering an alternative designation for him." Councilwoman Reed nodded slowly. "We'll take this under consideration. But the fact remains. Echo still carries the knowledge Officer Blake died trying to share." Then she looked toward June. "You said he remembers." June stepped forward. "Yes," she replied, voice shaking but steady. "And some memories we weren't meant to forget." The hall hadn't yet recovered from Echo's alert when Councilwoman Reed called for order. Murmurs rolled across the wooden benches like distant thunder. Reporters whispered into phones. Sheriff Nolan leaned over to speak with Dr. Way, while Carver's legal team huddled in low, tense voices. In the center of it all stood Sienna, small, unmoving, one hand still resting on Echo's shoulder. Councilman DeWitt adjusted his glasses. "We've seen compelling evidence," he said slowly. "But this is still an unprecedented situation. A child claiming custodianship of a retired law enforcement canine." "He's not just a dog," Sienna said. The room fell quiet again. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. She stepped forward, Echo following obediently. June started to move toward her, then stopped. Agnes put a gentle hand on June's arm, as if to say, "Let her." Sienna turned to face the council. Her eyes were wide but steady, her fists clenched by her sides. "He remembers what they want to forget," she said. "He remembers my dad." There was a pause, just long enough for the weight of those words to land. Everyone keeps talking about what Echo can or can't do, about rules and property and contracts, but no one's asking him what he knows. Her small fingers tapped her chest. "I remember the fire, not the flames, but the silence. After they told us Daddy was gone, I stopped speaking. I couldn't, not to anyone, not even Mom." She glanced back at Echo. "But I talked to him." Echo's ears perked. "I told him everything," Sienna whispered, "because he was there, because he was with Dad." She swallowed. "And I think that's why he came back. Not just because I wanted him, but because he still had something to finish." A reporter lowered his camera. Another stopped writing. Even Carver's lead attorney, for a moment, looked unsure. He didn't sit today because of training. He sat because he remembered. Her voice cracked on the last word. And maybe that's what my dad was trying to do too. Remember something no one else wanted to see. Maybe that's why they let him die. Gasps echoed through the chamber. "Objection," snapped one of Carver's men. "This is speculative. Emotional." Councilwoman Reed raised a hand. "She has the floor." Sienna's lip trembled, but she didn't look away. "I don't want revenge," she said softly. "I just want the truth. I want people to know that my dad mattered, that Echo still does." She hesitated, then walked up to the bench and placed something on the council's table. It was a photo. Nathan Blake, in uniform, one arm slung around Echo's neck, both smiling. "This is the only picture where he looks happy after the fire at Station 6, Sienna said. He smiled because Echo was there. The silence that followed was longer this time. Reed looked to Sheriff Nolan, then to Councilman DeWitt, then to the rest of the room. "We've heard enough for today," she said at last. "The council will convene privately. Due to new evidence and testimony, we are suspending any decision until an independent investigation is completed." Carver stood abruptly, but no one paid him much attention anymore. Sienna turned back to Echo and whispered something no one else could hear. The shepherd licked her hand once, and when they walked out of the chamber side by side, it wasn't just the end of a hearing. It was the beginning of something no one in that town could ignore anymore. The wind howled down the abandoned service road like it remembered the fire. The remains of the East Line warehouse still stood at the edge of Snowridge blackened concrete. Soot, silence. Most avoided it. The ground felt wrong, like something buried there still breathed. Rick adjusted his backpack, frowning at the building. "Still smells like guilt." Michael stepped through the chain-link fence, voice recorder in hand. "No floor plans left. Funny how things vanish when you stop asking the right questions." June followed, silent, eyes locked on the ruin. Echo padded beside her. Nose low, tail still. He knew why they'd come. Inside, Michael pointed. "That's where they said the accelerant was found." "Or planted," Rick muttered. Echo froze, ears twitching, then lunged toward a collapsed beam. He clawed at the ground, scraping ash and dirt away. Under layers of soot they uncovered a metal hatch. Rick and Michael pried it open. Cold air rushed out, stale, metallic. A staircase led down. The room below was small. On a shelf, untouched folders lined up. Argon security stamps marked the papers inside. Test logs, chemical slips. A sealed biohazard case held vials of glowing blue liquid. On a chair sat a harness, stiff with blood, military grade. Echo. Unit K9. June's breath hitched. "They said it all burned." "Someone tried to bury a truth they couldn't kill," Michael said. Echo sniffed the harness, then sat beside it, waiting as if for orders that would never come. Mayor Holden didn't expect the knock. Midnight. Snow piling at the window. He sat alone, staring at a brandy glass and Michael's new article. Whistleblower cop may have died protecting Snowridge from a neurotoxic cover-up. 3 knocks. Agnes Monroe entered without waiting. She dropped an envelope on his desk. A photo spilled out. Holden, years younger, shaking hands with a man in an Argonne badge. "You signed the zoning. Your debts vanished. Your son's fine disappeared. And we let Nathan burn." Holden's voice broke. "You think I meant for that?" I think you let men bury who they wanted. She laid a USB beside the photo. Lab records, Echo's harness, the vials. Michael has it all. Holden trembled. Carver will pin it all on me. He has tapes, contacts. You still have a choice. He unlocked a cabinet, pulling out 3 journals. Nathan's initials on one. Inside, dates, test sites, Echo's name. The last line, if anything happens, it's Holden and Carver. Echo knows the rest. He always remembers. I'll give a statement, Holden whispered. Just get my family out. Start earning forgiveness, Agnes said. By morning, Michael's article exploded online. The town became a headline. At the community center, Councilwoman Reed read the press release. Echo is a protected federal witness. All files reopened. Marla Jennings stood. We failed you. One by one, others joined her. The town woke up. Carver Hale's mansion sat empty by noon. His jet left at dawn. His lies lingered in ash and abandoned rooms. That evening, candles lined the community center steps. No speeches, just faces in the dark, gathered for the truth. Echo stepped forward, a new collar holding Nathan's badge. Children approached him first. A girl hugged his neck, then others. Echo stood still silent, solid, as if he understood. In June's house, Sienna wrote quietly at the table. A thank you letter, she said. To who? Dad, for sending Echo back. She placed the folded note beside the old harness. He found us again. The wood-paneled walls of the Snowridge council chamber felt different that morning, not because they'd changed, but because the people inside them had. A week had passed since the expose. 7 days of headlines, subpoenas, resignations, and a town forced to reckon with truths buried in ash. At 9:00 a.m. sharp, Councilwoman Reed called the session to order. The chamber was packed, not with reporters, but with neighbors, former skeptics, believers. In the second row, between June and Agnes, sat Sienna. Echo lay beside her, ears perked, still as stone. Sheriff Nolan rose, voice steady but weary. For a long time, I believed in protocol, but I forgot the reason behind the badge. This dog carried a truth we didn't want to see. He protected the only one who kept listening. He nodded at Sienna, then at Echo. I recommend we formally certify Echo as a child therapy canine, permanently placed with the Blake family under community protection. Hands raised around the table. DeWitt, Reed, Santos, Nguyen, Ellis. A unanimous vote. Reed smiled gently at June. Would you or your daughter like to address the chamber? June stood. For 5 years we lived with silence. Echo carried the parts of Nathan we couldn't hold, and because of him, my daughter found her voice. Thank you for letting him stay. Then, without prompt, Sienna rose. When I couldn't speak, Echo stayed. When I missed my dad so much it hurt, he listened. If that's not therapy, I don't know what is. Applause. Warm, honest. Echo barked once short, proud, and laughter rippled through tears. That night, for the first time in years, Sienna slept through until morning. Echo beside her bed. The promise kept. A week later, sunlight filled the Snowridge Community Center gym. Banners, wildflowers, and a poster of Echo mid-stride framed a makeshift stage. Below his image, in a child's hand, some heroes don't talk. They listen. Agnes opened the ceremony. This is not just a tribute. It's a homecoming for a dog who gave us back our memory. Sienna stepped onto the stage, Echo beside her. She held Nathan's polished badge, now set into a new leather collar. When my dad died, people told me to be strong. Echo didn't. He just stayed. She knelt and fastened the collar. The badge rested at Echo's chest. His tail thumped once. Children spoke next. A boy in red sneakers. I didn't stutter when Echo sat next to me. A girl. I could sleep after he visited our class. A teen. I changed my mind about running away after I walked him. The mayor pro tem presented a certificate. Echo for bravery without expectation, for loyalty beyond command, for reminding us that memory is strength with a heartbeat. Click. Cameras flashed. The image of Echo standing tall would hang in schools, homes, and hearts. The old library became the Blake Center for Memory and Healing. A sign carved from cedar marked its mission. In honor of Officer Nathan Blake and all who remember. Inside, soft colors, art supplies, and framed photos lined the walls. Echo's corner held a worn blanket and his favorite toy. On Sienna's first day back at school, she tucked treats in her backpack. Echo walked beside her. In the hallway, kids didn't stare. They nodded, smiled. When asked to write about a memory she never wanted to forget, Sienna didn't hesitate. Outside the center, Agnes tied a blue and gold ribbon around a young elm tree. To what cannot be forgotten. Sienna touched the bark. Will it get big? If we care for it, Agnes said. If we let it breathe. Inside, the center welcomed its first visitor, a boy who wouldn't look up, shoulders tight. Echo laid his head on the boy's foot. The boy looked down and didn't pull away. The town had changed. Not because it wanted to. Because a girl spoke. Because a dog remembered. And because truth chose to rise. The first snow of the season came gently, like breath on glass. In the early morning hush of Snowridge, rooftops shimmered under a thin veil of white. Tree branches caught flakes like whispered promises. The town, for once, was still. Sienna Blake pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, her boots crunching softly along the slush-dusted sidewalk. She held the leash loosely in one mittened hand, though she knew she didn't need to. Echo walked beside her, calm and steady as ever. His graying coat caught flecks of snow, and he blinked slowly each time one drifted past his muzzle. They passed the corner bakery, its windows fogged with warmth and sugar. Mrs. Delaney was already inside, arranging cinnamon rolls. She looked up, saw them through the glass, and gave a little wave. Sienna smiled and waved back. She didn't speak much in town. She didn't need to. People knew now. They understood. The world didn't need her to be loud. Just true. They reached the bend where the auction hall still stood, unchanged in shape, but changed forever in meaning. The old planks still groaned in the cold. The paint still peeled along the awning. But now, someone had strung little white lights across the front. There was talk of converting the place into a youth arts center come spring. Echo paused in front of the entrance. For a moment, he simply stood there, ears tilting. Sienna let the silence stretch. Her breath formed little clouds in the air. Then she turned, stepping toward the tree. It had grown fast. The elm Agnes planted now reached higher than the fence. Its young branches stretched toward the sky like they remembered how to pray. Snow dusted its limbs, and a faint wind made it whisper like paper turning in an old book. Sienna knelt at the base, brushing snow away with careful fingers. There was a small hollow in the trunk just wide enough for folded secrets. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, worn soft from handling. She had rewritten it 3 times before settling on what mattered. 3 words. 2 sentences. "Thank you, Dad." She pressed the note gently into the hollow and let her hand rest there, her palm against the bark. The tree felt warm beneath the chill, alive, rooted. Behind her, Echo shifted. He let out a low, contented sound, somewhere between a sigh and a hum. Sienna stood again, brushing her mittens together. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. The ache in her chest had softened over time, not erased, not filled, but made bearable, because now there was space for more than grief. There was memory. There was movement. She looked up at the tree again, then turned to Echo. He looked at her, waiting. "I'm ready," she whispered. He trotted forward, tail swaying once. She followed, and as they walked away from the place where it all began, the snow fell a little harder, gentle, persistent, endless, covering what had been, nourishing what would come next. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, sending dancing shadows along the wooden walls of the living room. Outside, dusk draped itself across Snowridge, turning the world a deep blue-gray. Snowflakes tapped gently against the windows, like someone knocking softly just to say they were still there. Rick Blake sat on the couch, a small square box wrapped in weathered brown paper resting on his lap. He turned it over once more in his hands, as if debating something. Then he looked across the room at Sienna. She was sitting cross-legged on the rug with Echo beside her, brushing his coat in long, quiet strokes. The dog leaned into her rhythm, eyes half closed, chest rising and falling in sync with the hum of the room. Rick cleared his throat. "Sienna?" She looked up. Her eyes, so much like Nathan's, met his. He stood slowly, walking over. His hands, though calloused and big, handled the box like it might crack open too soon. "I've been carrying this for a long time," he said, kneeling to her level. "It belonged to your dad. He always said it wasn't just about direction. It was about knowing where you are when everything else gets lost." Sienna tilted her head. He offered her the package. "Go ahead." Her fingers worked at the twine, unwrapping the folds carefully. Inside was a brass compass, dulled at the edges but still intact. The initials N.B. were faintly etched on the underside, the letters worn soft by years of fingers brushing over them. Sienna cupped it in her palm like it might disappear if she blinked. Rick's voice dipped lower. He carried that on every call, every mission. When we scattered, that thing kept him centered. Now, he hesitated, swallowed. "Now it's yours." For a moment the only sound was the pop of the fire. Then Sienna whispered, "Thank you." Rick nodded, eyes glassy. "You found your voice, kiddo. Now find your way." Echo, as if on cue, nudged his snout gently against her shoulder. Then he lowered his head, resting it across her legs. Sienna looked down at the compass again, her fingers curling around it protectively. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She stood. With the compass still in hand, she walked to the front door, Echo padding behind her. The porch was blanketed in white. Snowflakes clung to the railing, the steps, the world. But it felt quiet, not cold, not lonely. She opened the compass. Its needle swung once, then settled steady. She smiled. Rick stood at the doorway now, watching her. "Where's it pointing?" She looked back over her shoulder. "Forward." And with that, She stepped off the porch. Not far. Just enough. Enough to say, "I'm still here." Echo trotted beside her, his paws leaving perfect twin prints in the snow. Behind them, the Blake house glowed like a lighthouse in winter, warm, alive, waiting. The sun bled slowly into the edge of the hills, painting the Snowridge horizon in strokes of amber, rust, and deep violet. The air was still, holding its breath in reverence. From their perch atop the knoll behind the counseling center, just past the elm tree Agnes had planted, Sienna and Echo sat watching the day's final light curl over the town. It had become their quiet place. No one else came up here, just the girl, the dog, and the unspoken things between them. Sienna sat cross-legged on the old quilt June had stitched together from Nathan's uniform's torn patches from shirts and jackets, even a swatch from the harness Echo used to wear. It smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Echo lay beside her, his body pressed lightly against her side. He didn't move much these days unless she did. The gray around his muzzle had deepened, the scars on his shoulder more visible beneath his thinning coat. But his eyes had never dulled. They still scanned the tree line, still flicked to the horizon when the wind shifted, still listened for things no one else could hear, and still always came back to her. Sienna leaned into him, resting her head against his neck. Her fingers absently traced the ridge of his badge-shaped tag, the one with Nathan's initials carved underneath. It clinked softly when it moved, like a memory trying not to disappear. "You're tired," she whispered. Echo didn't answer, of course. But the slow rise and fall of his breath was steady, present, anchored. Sienna pulled something from her coat pocket, a small square of paper, folded and softened with time. She unfolded it gently. It was her own handwriting, large, a little shaky, from the year she'd started speaking again. It read, "He came home for me, so I stayed." She placed it beside Echo's paw, then looked out at the sun. Silence settled between them, not heavy, not hollow, just true. She reached out, laying her hand along the side of his face, feeling the heat of him beneath the fur. Then, softly, like a secret passed between only those who'd earned it, she said, "Off duty, partner." At the sound of those words, Echo blinked slowly. His ears, once always alert, eased back. He lowered his head to the quilt and exhaled, long and full. And then he was still. Not gone, just resting. Sienna didn't cry. She didn't reach for him. She just sat there beside him as the last light dipped below the horizon and the stars came out one by one, like promises never forgotten. The town below began to flicker with porch lights, distant laughter, life going on. But up here, in this quiet space between what was and what would be, a girl sat beside her dog, her partner, and watched the sky shift. Because some dogs never forget, especially the ones who were never meant to. Some bonds go beyond words, beyond even time itself. In Echo's story, we're reminded that love, real love, isn't always loud. Sometimes it sits quietly beside us, watches over us through the darkest nights, and stays long after the world has forgotten. German shepherds like Echo are more than just dogs. They are protectors, partners, and keepers of memory. They carry the weight of silence, of sacrifice, of loyalty that asks for nothing in return. And in the right moment, just when we need it most, they remind us who we are and who we still have left to become. This story is a tribute to those who wait at the door, who never leave our side, and who teach us that healing often begins with a paw on your knee. If you've ever been saved by an animal, or loved one beyond words, this story is yours too. Thank you for believing in second chances. And thank you for listening.